the 16th of March 1945 OKW. Forward Planning Offices treated the Rhine as the last structural barrier in the West, less a river than a guarantee. Maps sent down to corps and divisions showed complete defenses, watched bridges, prepared obstacles, pre-registered artillery, and a timetable that assumed terrain and winter logistics would impose automatic delay on any Allied attempt. Staff language reflected this certainty. Briefings focused on sequential preparation, supply allocations, regimented riverbank deployments, scheduled rotations, not on the possibility that speed could override the plan. Army Group B intelligence assessments circulated on the 10th to the 11th of March reinforced the central belief any serious Allied crossing would require at least 72 hours to develop. The estimate was repeated like doctrine. Reports of rapid Allied movement were expected to exist, but to conform to established patterns. Patton's reputation for bold maneuver was acknowledged, yet categorized as doctrinally conventional, dangerous, but still expected to follow familiar axes and timing. No staff officer argued that tempo itself could dissolve the river's defensive. Valued out by 1200 on the 12th of March. Supply allocation for Rhine defenses was near completion. Infantry regiments were positioned around likely crossing points, reinforced by artillery battalions oriented to cover expected bridgeheads. Mines and obstacles lined the riverbank approaches. Pontoon assets remained undeployed to avoid premature exposure. Fuel was stockpiled for mobile reserves, with planners assuming consumption would stay within projections, because the enemy could not arrive before the river and terrain imposed delay. The accounting looked orderly. The assumptions were never forward. Elements of the 12th Panzer Division reported no observable Allied concentration within 60 kilometers of the western bank. Signals intelligence showed sporadic chatter consistent with reconnaissance, not large-scale preparation. This was filed as confirmation. The Rhine was functioning as intended, a delaying line. Pins were placed neatly along defensive sectors. The quiet efficiency of preparation masked a deeper absence. Contingency planning for initiative outside the timetable remained thin. By the evening of the 15th of March, final coordination meetings at Army headquarters addressed resupply, artillery rotations, and reserve readiness. Fuel trucks, ammunition, convoys, and rations were calculated with precision. A senior staff officer noted that any crossing before the 18th of March would be optimally delayed by terrain and cold. No one dissented. Weather forecasts offered no disruption to the assumption. Low clouds, occasional snowfall, sustained freezing temperatures. Cigarette smoke hung in the briefing rooms, and the smell of cold metal from cleaned rifles seemed to confirm a procedural confidence orderly defense as an inevitability. At 0300 on the 16th of March, reconnaissance reports from the 12th and 21st Infantry Divisions indicated unusual movement near the Remagen sector, mechanized units shifting, bridging attempts at points previously deemed secondary. The reports were fragmented and labeled low reliability, possible diversion. They were forwarded up the chain, logged, and acknowledged without immediate adjustment. The default interpretation held. Probing actions, not an operational thrust by 0615. Intercepted Allied radio traffic confirmed multiple armored columns moving in synchronization along secondary routes toward the Rhine. Signals intelligence flagged. The activity is notable, but analysis lagged behind the tempo. Anything outside mapped phase lines was regarded with skepticism. In the intelligence office, the enemy rhythm was measured against expectations, so departures from the plan were treated as provisional rather than urgent. At 0730, scheduled riverbank inspection cycles proceeded as normal. Battalion commanders checked obstacles, verified targeting data, and logged minor inconsistencies as routine maintenance issues. The commanding general reaffirmed that the river remained secure. Calm was not merely a mood. It was a method of command, and it reinforced the belief that the plan still held. By 1000. Third Army movements were already exceeding German timelines. Field reports trickled in describing minor bridgeheads and fording attempts, but initial staff assessments continued to interpret the activity as localized harassment rather than decisive initiative. The command culture filtered new information through old expectations. Each map pin still communicated readiness, even as the reality those pins represented was shifting underneath them. At 1130, German High Command convened an ad hoc coordination, meeting corps commanders, intelligence officers, artillery staff. The room was tense, yet discipline suppressed. Open alarm. One intelligence officer suggested that multiple armored units could be consolidating for an early crossing, carefully phrased as a hypothesis. The response was procedural. Confirmation first, then adjustment. No immediate redeployment was authorized. Urgency remained subordinate to verification. By 1315, field reports could no longer be reconciled with the assumptions. Forward observers confirmed that engineers and armored elements had reached the far bank near Rhine, establishing a tenuous bridgehead. The first shock was logistical. Artillery plans calibrated for a 24 to 36-hour delay now faced immediate threat to headquarters. Staff rotated maps, verified coordinates, and marked deviations, and red pencil yet the true scale of the incursion was still underappreciated. By 1500, conflicting orders from Corps and Army headquarters collided. Corps commanders sought clarification, engage aggressively, or reinforce secondary positions. Army command deferred decisions pending further confirmation. Communications strained under simultaneous messages. Teletype traffic slowed. Radio, nets congested. Updates arrived out of order. Officers exchanged looks of quiet tension, aware that any hesitation had measurable cost. By 1630, Patton's lead units began expanding the bridgehead toward key crossroads. Artillery intended for delayed engagement was already within range of advancing American armor. German resistance was sporadic, reactive. Army Group B issued broad reminders of defensive priorities, but lacked specific direction for multiple crossings and fast-moving columns. Staff officers annotated maps and noted risk exposure, but decisive reserve shifts still lagged behind the reality on the ground. At 1800, High Command faced the undeniable. The Rhine had been crossed before defenses were fully prepared. Senior generals gathered in dim rooms. Maps were re-annotated rapidly. Fuel allocations for mobile reserves calculated for delay were now insufficient to react in depth. Artillery targeting required immediate recalibration. Communications with isolated corps were delayed. Confirmations took hours. Anxiety was controlled, but the realization was structural. Time had ceased to favor defensive assumptions by 1930. Consequences accumulated. Bridges were partially secured. Enemy armor was positioned beyond anticipated limits. Forward infantry on the German side faced pressure without sufficient support. Orders previously issued under the assumption of delay required rapid revision. Any corrective measure enforcement counterattack reposition was hampered by logistics, winter friction, and the speed of Allied initiative. Confidence eroded into reactive disorder. By 2100, the Rhine crossing had become an operational crisis. Staff officers rotated between phone lines, radio nets, and map tables, updating phase lines in near real time. Each decision carried immediate consequences for adjacent sectors. The risk of compounding error increased with every hour. The failure was not only tactical, it was cultural. Expectation had overridden observation until the timetable collapsed. The night ended with grim clarity. The Rhine no longer functioned as a barrier. Bridgeheads held, reserves were overextended. Cohesion among German forces was fragmenting. A command structure built for predictability was forced into improvisation. Under an imposed tempo, initiative had shifted decisively, and the strategic consequences were already trending toward irreversibility. The 17th of March 1945 by 02:00, German reconnaissance along the Rhine's western approaches reported activity inconsistent with prior expectations. Patrols observed armored columns advancing along roads previously deemed secondary, with intervals between elements under 10 minutes tempo, impossible under routine assumptions. Battalion and regimental commanders documented anomalies with timestamps and coordinates, forwarding reports that emphasized speed and concentration. By 03:05, intercepted radio transmissions corroborated the observation. Message density increased across multiple U.S. units. Call signs suggested coordinated movement between armor, infantry, and engineers. Yet analysis remained tentative. Doctrine assumed early morning intensity could be feints or localized maneuvers, unless verified by multiple sources. The possibility of a coordinated crossing was acknowledged, then downweighted, reflecting institutional bias toward predictable timelines. At 0410, forward commanders held an informal council under dim lamps. One intelligence officer warned that timing, direction, and density did not fit routine probing. He pointed to corridors that bypassed primary defensive nodes. Senior staff listened, then opted to await corroboration rather than act on projections, reinforcing a pattern of hesitation. By 0530, Army Group B headquarters received conflicting interpretations, monitor versus coordinated thrust, verification required. The Chief of Staff deferred. Orders for immediate counter-deployment were withheld pending additional confirmation. Telephones crackled, reports overlapped. Latency increased. The system responded by cataloging, not by pivoting. By 0615, reconnaissance near Remagen observed engineers deploying bridging material and armor, forming loose spearheads on river-adjacent roads. The details suggested organized intent, yet staff categorization still read probable. Harassment with a caveat. Assumed natural delay from river obstacles. Expectation reframed observation into something less urgent than it was. By 0730, Corps-level orders kept forward units anchored to predetermined primary crossings, leaving secondary approaches thinly monitored. Field units noted gaps, but reports were treated as minor. An operations officer logged the discrepancy. Secondary axis exposure increasing. No orders to adjust. Maps changed slowly. The battlefield changed quickly. By 0845, intercepts suggested multiple Allied elements moving in concert along parallel routes while engineers constructed minor crossings at tributaries and forts. Analysts debated. One warned that a coordinated advance could compromise battalion positions if left unchecked. Another argued the timing still fit the expected delay window and that reports could be exaggerated. The debate consumed time. No decisive adjustment followed. At 0930, a liaison from 12th Panzer Division delivered first-hand accounts. Disciplined columns, engineers securing bypass routes, rapid refueling despite cold. The report was received, nodded at, filed. Still no major reallocation of reserves occurred. The chain of command remained committed to a timetable that was already failing. By 10:45, High Command convened another briefing. Maps were layered with pins, string, and logistical notes. The Chief of Staff argued observed actions could indicate a large-scale maneuver or well-timed feints, recommending aerial verification yet weather made surveillance ineffective. Without proof, procedure, restrained action. By 1200, artillery instructions fractured. Some batteries were told to hold fire pending confirmation, others to redirect targets to secondary routes based on ambiguous reconnaissance. The result was inconsistent firing and internal uncertainty. Logs began to note the core issue directly. Enemy speed surpassing assumed delay intervals. By 1330, limited repositioning began, constrained by narrow roads, congestion from supply, convoys, and winter attrition. Fuel and ammunition allocations had been calculated for a slower enemy. They were now insufficient. Vehicles stalled in icy patches. Artillery could not shift quickly. Infantry companies moved late and thin. Forward, commanders wrote plainly. Resources inadequate to meet speed. Orders delayed. Consequences immediate. By Fiandret, conflicting assessments of Allied intent reached upper command feints. Versus real Bridgehead's commanders debated credibility, weighing precedent against anomalies, and documented disagreements meticulously. Meanwhile, Allied tempo exploited gaps created by indecision. Verification required circled again and again while time drained away. By 1630, the consequences became operationally visible. American armored contingents bypassed primary defensive nodes and threatened supply lines. German units expended limited ammunition in piecemeal defense. Reports filtered upward, processed through expectation rather than actuality. Decisions were postponed. Defensive initiative remained unclaimed. By 1800, High Command faced a dilemma, expanding by the hour. Uncertainty undermined confidence in the defensive framework. A tentative recommendation to shift reserves and reposition artillery was acknowledged, with left corps commanders already constrained by fuel, traffic, and frozen roads. Delays multiplied. Tempo remained with the Allies. By 1930, Allied forces consolidated multiple points along the western approaches, establishing positions capable of immediate exploitation. German forces were dispersed and out of phase. The timetable doctrine fractured. Logs repeated the same warning. Assumption invalidated. Immediate action required. By 2100, communications clogged with fragmented updates. Field commanders awaited orders not yet issued. Hesitation persisted, and the operational rhythm, dictated by planned sequencing, was disrupted beyond procedural control. The night ended with the same immutable fact. The Rhine's automatic delay had failed, and the system built to rely on it struggled to adapt quickly enough. 18 March 1945, by 0100, forward units reported that Allied tempo on secondary routes had hardened into a direct threat. Reconnaissance confirmed multiple armored columns approaching crossing points west of Remagen and Oberlin-Stein. Positions held as contingencies were inadequately fortified. Incomplete trenches, damaged obstacles, partial minefields. Regimental logs admitted gaps, too large to fix. Locally by 0145, Corps headquarters attempted to reconcile disparate reports. Radio interference and conflicting timestamps produced corrupted orders. Artillery reposition messages overlapped with units already committed to primary lines. Staff annotated, positions unclear, risk of misfire and exposure high. Yet procedural rigidity kept battalion commanders frozen in place, unless explicitly directed exactly when improvisation was required. At 0310, isolated actions began. A Panzer Grenadier regiment attempted an improvised counter-deployment to cover a river approach. Units moved without mutual awareness. One company occupied a position intended for another, leaving the adjacent sector open. Forward observers watched enemy columns bypass the misaligned defense. Logs recorded frustration. Plan unfit. Units acting without coordination. By 0435, artillery batteries faced similar failure. Fire plans were built for expected timing and primary vectors. Ammunition was limited. Resupply was hampered by snow and narrow routes. Corrective fire suffered from target acquisition delays and miscommunication between observers and fire direction centers. Effectiveness fell as the enemy tempo increased. 80530. Revised Army orders arrived incomplete. Corps staff received partial directives referencing only northern allocations. Southern guidance was missing. Field commanders interpreted fragments according to best judgment, producing contradictory deployments. Some units reinforced our positions while other sectors remained UNDE, FENDED. By 0645, consequences were immediate. Allied armored units exploited gaps, crossed minor tributaries, and bypassed primary fortifications. Fuel shortages, immobilized vehicles needed to reposition reserves. Ammunition convoys were blocked by stalled traffic and snow accumulation. The defense designed for an enemy slowed by terrain could not move fast enough to respond. By 0740, localized panic emerged as defensive reflex. Some commanders concentrated limited forces near obvious bridge approaches, leaving lateral sectors exposed. Companies acted autonomously, building hasty barricades without coordination. Reports repeated the same line. Orders conflict with reality. Synchronized action impossible. By 0830, I Command attempted to centralize decisions, issuing directives to consolidate at critical points. Corps commanders were constrained by misallocations and traffic congestion. Units ordered to move encountered icy gradients, stalled vehicles, and frozen equipment. Communication lags persisted. Radio transmissions overlapped and corrupted. By 0915, the operational failure was visible. Allied units crossed minor points unopposed. Mechanized infantry followed tanks, securing roads and bridges. German artillery expended scarce ammunition, with limited effect. Logs captured disbelief. The line was being bypassed before the first major engagement. By 1040, command cohesion deteriorated further. Orders to deploy reserves north conflicted with emergent needs in the south. Regiments crossed paths, created bottlenecks, and arrived late. Situational awareness lagged by up to an hour in some sectors, enough for armored spearheads to exploit openings and widen them. Contradictory directives struck the same formations: move north, then hold south. Clarification did not arrive in time. Battalion commanders tried partial compliance, splitting companies between tasks and creating new gaps. Defensive improvisation replaced coherent alignment. By 1300, the integrity of the Rhine defensive line had eroded. Allied spearheads seized road junctions planners assumed unreachable. Messages about breaches took 40 minutes to reach corps. Coordination between artillery, infantry, and mechanized units lagged behind the enemy's tempo. Attempts to restore continuity were constrained by fuel shortages, frozen roads, and communications friction. By 1415 to 1900, errors compounded. Misaligned artillery, thin infantry, immobilized reserves, contradictory orders. Engagements occurred in isolated pockets. Commanders fought the enemy and the system simultaneously. By evening, the Rhine defensive assumption was invalid. In practice, the line no longer functioned as a barrier. The 19th of March, 1945, HO Berlin. By late morning, reports arriving at OKW in Berlin coalesced into an unavoidable truth. Patton's forces had crossed at multiple points before fortifications and denial measures were fully established. The expected buffer days had collapsed into hours. Maps on the operations table showed bridgeheads near Remagen and Oberlandstein and Boop, margins filled with pencil notes, partial fortifications, reserves delayed. Artillery not aligned. At 11:15, Joe Dahl convened senior staff, including Luftwaffe representatives. The picture was grim. Forward positions intended to delay crossings were incomplete or bypassed. Divisions had lost cohesion under pressure. Bridges were lightly defended due to miscommunication and conflicting directives. Reserves were positioned too far east to intervene quickly. No single unit could contain the incursion. At 11:30, the speed of Allied advance was displayed bluntly. Planned delay, measured in 48 hours, realized delay closer to 12. Reserve response timelines were inadequate. Reports admitted the counter-thrust window had effectively closed. Coordinated reaction across multiple corps sectors was logistically improbable under current conditions. By 1200 to 1230, discussion shifted from prevention to feasibility. Redeploying reserves required 24 to 36 hours under ideal circumstances, likely longer under disruption. Low cloud and snow limited aerial reconnaissance and interdiction, without effective air observation or rapid ground reserves. The Rhine's defensive value built on delay was functionally nullified by speed. By and the Inhamvre. Authority itself became a problem. Corps along the Rhine were effectively isolated. Orders conflicted with local decisions made under duress. producing inconsistent deployments. Some units reinforced bridges already bypassed. Others neglected exposed sectors. Junior commanders hesitated to act beyond explicit orders. Senior staff struggled to reconcile doctrine with a front evolving faster than verification could catch by 1315 to 1430. High command acknowledged what memos and logs repeated. Operational tempo exceeded planning assumptions. The river's delay value was gone. Strategic reserves were insufficient to reverse momentum. The focus shifted from reversal to containment damage limitation, fallback positions, preservation of remaining cohesion. By 1500 hours, the strategic reality had settled into the room, with a weight that no map could soften. German High Command no longer debated whether the Rhine crossing could be reversed. The question had narrowed to how much damage could be limited before Allied momentum rendered even containment impossible. Orders issued after this point reflected constraint, not confidence. Language shifted. Hold became delay. Counterattack became local resistance. Staff officers annotated fallback lines not as maneuver options, but as last organizational anchors to prevent total fragmentation. The river, once treated as a structural guarantee, was now only a geographic reference. Its strategic value spent. Field reports arriving through the afternoon confirmed the pattern. American armored units were no longer merely crossing. They were consolidating. Engineers reinforced bridgeheads under fire. Mechanized infantry secured roads beyond the river faster than German reserves could reposition. Each hour of delay magnified the imbalance. Where German doctrine required confirmation, Allied tempo required none. By 1630, communications from Army Group B emphasized the same constraint repeatedly. Mobility had collapsed. Fuel shortages immobilized formations intended for countermovement. Artillery units, misaligned and undersupplied, fired sporadically, with limited effect. Infantry companies held ground out of discipline rather than expectation of relief. The command structure remained intact in form, but its ability to influence events was diminishing. OKW. Senior officers recognized the deeper failure was not tactical misplacement, but temporal miscalculation. Planning had assumed that terrain imposed time. Reality demonstrated that initiative could erase it. The Rhine had not been defeated by firepower alone, but by speed executed faster than verification could authorize response. By early evening, discussions turned explicitly to preservation. Orders emphasized preventing encirclement of remaining forces, maintaining cohesion where possible, and avoiding unnecessary losses. Strategic ambition vanished from the language entirely. No directive referenced reclaiming the western bank. The focus was survival of structure, not victory of position. Reports from the field grew increasingly fragmented. Units operated under partial orders, often outdated by the time they arrived. Battalion commanders exercised local judgment within narrow limits, constrained by fear of acting beyond authority and the absence of clear intent from above. Initiative, once centralized, now emerged only in small defensive decisions made under pressure. By nightfall, the psychological impact of the crossing became unmistakable. Officers who had spent weeks reinforcing the Rhine as an idea and not just a line now confronted the collapse of that belief. The river's failure forced a reckoning with a deeper truth. German command doctrine built on predictability and procedural sequencing could not match an enemy willing to compress decision, movement, and execution into a single motion. The night of the 19th of March closed without resolution, only acceptance. Maps were updated with fallback positions that had not existed 24 hours earlier. Communications emphasized endurance rather than response. The war in the West had entered its final phase not because the Rhine was crossed, but because the assumptions behind it had been exposed as brittle for the German High Command. Patton's crossing was not merely an operational setback, it was a revelation. Speed, when paired with coordination and intent, had invalidated a defense designed to function automatically. The loss was not the river, it was time. From that moment forward, every decision would be made under pressure already behind schedule. Initiative belonged elsewhere. The strategic clock no longer paused for planning rooms, confirmations, or doctrine. It moved with the columns already advancing eastward.